Patrick, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Doug. Good to be with you.
Why are so many people struggling with their mental health right now, despite a lot of the advances that we've had, over the last decade or so?
I say in my new book, Profiles in Mental Health Courage, that the thing I'm most shocked about is that everybody is shocked that this is so bad. This has been bad for a long time. And it seems as though, obviously, when COVID happened, there was greater appreciation and understanding about how widespread this challenge was. I think people all kind of were able to identify their own challenges and then not look at those who had addiction and mental illness as something other than themselves. And that kind of really advanced our ability to look at this as a common struggle, not as, something that was unique to individuals who just couldn't muster the willpower to get over it. So I think, obviously, with the younger generation, it's clear that I think social media has contributed a great deal to the difficulty they have with resilience. Now, of course, today, in this world that we live in, it's very toxic. It's very stressful for everybody of every age group. And certainly COVID, with the isolation, taught us a lot about the fact that these illnesses thrive really when people are isolated, as they say in recovery. Being in your own mind, it's like being in a dark room developing negatives. You have this predisposition to kind of think negative when everything around us is telling us negative stories. So I just think that, we are in a challenging time. And as much as we say, oh, wow, we've broken down stigma, it's not the same, shameful illness that it used to be. The fact is, as I, indicate in my book, that people are still very reticent to share much. If anything, today they say they have a diagnosis, but that's about where it ends. People really don't dig any deeper, which means a lot of people don't understand that their own challenges are not so unique. As we know, ourselves being in recovery, the best thing about being, in recovery is the fact that we realize we're not alone. We hear other people's stories, and we know that those stories show us that the complexity of these illnesses really isn't that unique to us. And other people have those same challenges that we have. The real problem we have today is we have no prevention system. So we don't have, educate kids on how to self-modulate, the things that we learn in recovery. We learn to identify our counterproductive thinking patterns. We learn tools on how to intervene, that famous saying in recovery, we have to push the pause button, before we say something and react to something that makes it worse. Like simple tools like that. We ought to be teaching our kids coping mechanisms, problem-solving skills, because as we've learned today, those skills are the differentiating factor in a person's success in this world. Because everybody, as I said, has stress. We need to protect people wherever possible through building this agency, as they say, ability to manage your own challenges. And of course, I'll end with this, my parity work, holding insurance companies accountable to the parity law, reveals to me over and over again that we still have not ended up paying for these illnesses like we would any other set of illnesses. And that, frankly, is what's keeping us in the dark in terms of our ability to really meet the challenges today head on with the system that provides timely access to care.
You covered so much. And I think the thing to unpack first, is this idea of loneliness. You mentioned during the pandemic that people were more isolated, which exacerbates mental illness, as we know. And you also said that normally people will say they have something like depression or anxiety, and it just stops there. They don't get to the underlying stuff of what's going on. Do you think the root of that, given what you just said, is the fact that people are just feeling disconnected from themselves? They are feeling more isolated as a whole, given, how social media has forced us to disconnect from our sense of self and that we're not gathering in community like we used to. There's not as many kids playing outside. There's not a lot of activities like there used to be. Do you think that's at the root of all this?
Well, I think it's clearly a major, major factor in this. I mean, I feel so grateful that I didn't grow up with a cell phone in my hand, with social media around me. I really worried for my kids. Our 15-year-old, we moved her from the full iPhone to a one that just has talk and text. I mean, these phones are addictive. Social media is addictive. And then, of course, we have all kinds of new addiction for profit industries that are really capitalizing on that social isolation. You know, you see the commercialization of marijuana. Now, I don't want to lock people up for having a drug addiction. I've been spending my life trying to get more access to treatment and, frankly, to reforming the criminal justice system so we have mental health courts, drug courts, and the like. But we don't want to create a new big tobacco where an industry has no conscience at all other than to make profits. And they're going to make profits however they can. And if it means, you know, expanding the number of people who use their product, which, of course, is what capitalism is all about, then that means you put more people at risk for becoming addicted. I'm not saying everybody is going to become addicted, but obviously you increase the net number of people using, you're going to increase the net number of people who have addiction at a time when we're incapable of really addressing this with the support and services and people that we need to treat these illnesses. So, but I go back to your point. I think that social media really does cut down on our ability to be social, to understand real connection. There's a psychiatrist who wrote a book, Dopamine Nation.
Yeah, I know Anna. Anna, she's been on here a few times.
Yeah, she's fantastic. I just love that book because I think it's true. We're so used to now looking for the dopamine hit. And as I've learned in recovery myself, you know, I thought it was the fact I was taking Oxycontin, Adderall, or benzodiazepines, drinking, all that. You know, I'm sober from drugs and alcohol, but I will tell you my challenge today is not looking for behavioral fixes for my anxiety and depression. I think a lot of people self-soothe through, you know, scrolling, doing social media. I know I have to be intentional about putting my phone down, especially with my kids around, because I want them to know I'm looking at them. I'm not looking at my phone.
It seems to me, though, that there's way more people today struggling with mental health than there was like when I grew up. And if you talk to like my parents or you talk to people in their 50s and 60s, they acknowledge that people were, quote unquote, like mentally unhealthy. But they would also say it just seems like everybody now has something. That would be like the pushback from people in that generation. Do you think back then people still, I mean, I know you said this isn't anything new, but do you think back then people just still had the same number of issues, people were just afraid to talk about it? Or do you think the rise in technology and social media and forcing people to be isolated from oneself has really poured gasoline on this existing fire?
No, I think that we've always had these challenges. As I said at the outset, you know, I obviously took the title of my book, Profiles in Mental Health Courage, off my uncle, President Kennedy's Profiles in Courage. And when I looked at the senators that he featured in his Profiles in Courage, it was really shocking to me how many of them had addiction and mental illness in their families. I mean, you know, Lucius Lamar, it was in his diary, you know, recalls how his father came into the house, wrote a goodbye note, walked out in front of their house and took a pistol to his head and killed himself. John Quincy Adams had numerous family members die of alcoholism and one who died of suicide. Sam Houston was referred to as the big drunk. Daniel Webster died of cirrhosis of the liver. I mean, my point is back then, and President Kennedy didn't mention it, I mean, it's just amazing. We just were unconscious of not talking about this. And so the good news today is we're more conscious about making sure we talk about it. The problem is we have so much catching up to do to change the medical system so that it treats these illnesses in the same way it treats diabetes and cardiovascular disease and other chronic illnesses. Because we do know evidence-based treatments. Frankly, cognitive behavioral therapy, as applied to different diagnoses, there's different types of cognitive behavioral therapy, works, can get people better. We know medications. We know a number of things, including the social drivers of health that help really stabilize people. These things are known, but we don't get people access to them because our system doesn't pay for them. And we just have not built the infrastructure to meet the enormous need that our country has now.
So would you say you'd be proposing like that everybody should have universal access to like mental health care? Because I know that insurance does cover like therapy and stuff now to a certain extent, right?
Right. But as you know, in recovery, it's a biopsychosocial illness, physical allergy, a mental obsession, and a spiritual malady. We know that you need all three legs of the stool for it to stand up. And so it's not enough to just give medication-assisted treatment without having therapy. It's not enough just to do the medical and, even the mental health and not have a stable home, purpose, a job that you're supported in your employment. There are many things that we need to really address. And in cancer and all these other illnesses, we have a personalized approach, which means we have some radiation therapy, some chemotherapy, some surgery. We really incorporate a whole litany of different tools. We don't do that in mental health. It's kind of one size fits all. And, that has to change if we're going to get people better. Now, what ends up happening is that this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. We don't think mental health really works. We don't think people get better from addiction. But the problem is we wait until it's a stage 4 illness before we even treat it. So if you waited till cancer became stage 4, more people would be dying of cancer than died today. But in addiction and mental illness, it's always stage 4 disease. You're always in a crisis before you get help. The key to other illnesses, diabetes, cancer, and the like, is you need to screen early. And when you screen early and you ask about family history of these illnesses, which doctors are just starting to do now, and frankly, probably in a very fragmented and spotty way, they ask me, has anyone in your family died of stroke, has had a heart attack, has had cancer? We answer those regularly. Everyone knows to expect those because it's a way of us ensuring we get better treatment. So that needs to happen in these illnesses. We need to take a much more proactive approach. We really take a reactive sick care approach. And there's no wonder people don't think mental health gets better with treatment, because what treatment would work if it's the very final stage of the disease? When the disease is really formulated, its wiring in your brain such that it's harder to break these patterns of thinking when they've become so ingrained. If you intervene earlier, you begin to have the brain is more malleable. You can develop new circuitry. You're not fixed in the way you think. Those are things that we just have to acknowledge if we're going to set up a new system. And of course, prevention is not paid for generally in this country, but specifically in mental health.
So what would prevention look like? Are you proposing that the primary care doctor would do some sort of evaluation on people at a certain age? What does that look like?
So first, I would say that education is not education if it's not training people how to cope, how to do problem solving. The things that we learn in recovery, we need to prepare and arm our kids with early, teaching them about their brain. They learn about all the other organs of their body. 2, when they do see a physician, yes, they need to be screened. And we ought to have screening kind of ubiquitous throughout the system. Obviously, a lot of kids who have adverse childhood experiences need to be screened. We know there's a major correlation between the number of risk factors growing up in a home where there's domestic violence, growing up in a home where one of the parents suffers from addiction themselves, growing up in a home where there's, poverty, and you could go on. And that corresponds to the risk factor that kids have. Now, if they're predisposed because there's a family history of mental illness or addiction, you can bet those environmental factors are going to kick that off. And the better you are at identifying that earlier, the better off you're going to be in keeping people from going down that road. So, so I've started something called the Kennedy Forum. President Kennedy was the one who signed the original Community Mental Health Act. And when I looked at other illnesses, HIV/AIDS, for example, their mantra was we ought to have 90% of people be screened, 90% of the people get evidence-based interventions, and 90% of the people supported in recovery. We need the exact same thing and should make that our goal in mental health and addiction. We need 90% screen. You would not be satisfied. You've broken a leg. Well, we might think of x-raying it. We might think that would just be not acceptable. Evidence-based interventions, well, maybe we'll put a cast on it, maybe we won't. We that's the way we treat mental health. And then, of course, rehab, physical rehab, requires you to get stronger and build your muscles back. That's what we need in addiction and mental health. So we need a 90-90-90 approach. And one of the things that's really been missing from our efforts is we have no movement, Doug. There is no political movement. And I mean this bipartisan. There's no accountability politically for politicians that they vote the right way. There's no, agenda that says this is the number of dollars we need to address this crisis. And as consumers and even people who work in the field, there is no listserv. So everyone who's a member of NRA, they know how to poll them and how to get them out to vote. If you're a member of a labor union, every bricklayer in your district, every iron worker, labor, teamster, municipal employee, they know. And those unions have a voice because they're organized. We do not have that voice. We have great organizations, but we have not matured to the fact that we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. We need to mobilize people who care about this issue and give them something to hold their political leaders accountable to.
We've had like evidence-based treatment for things like diabetes, heart disease, et cetera, for years. And our health as a nation has continued to get worse and worse each year. So I guess maybe my question is, and I think everything that you said is very valid, and I agree. What would need to happen like before that to make sure that this isn't like a Band-Aid approach where it's like if somebody grows up in a home where there's chaos, that they're no matter what, they're still going to have mental health stuff. Like what would be the step prior that either parents or families could do to help ensure that their kids aren't growing up in a state of mental health chaos?
Well, I absolutely believe that a big portion of our current crisis is driven by the fact that we haven't properly addressed alcoholism in our country. I'm an adult childhood alcoholic. I've learned a lot about this illness. I know about the cyclical nature, the family generational cycle of these illnesses. It's one of the reasons why we really need to think of treating these illnesses, not just the individual, but treating the family, because how are you going to get better if the family doesn't know those skills to support you in your recovery and frankly has insight to their own part in creating a world where your loved one is suffering in part because of your inability to understand your own reactive kind of behavior. So I think, Doug, you're really getting at the fact that we in our country, in this world, really don't have insight into our own kind of counterproductive thinking patterns self-destructive behaviors. We really don't understand how our amygdala works, the fear response. We really haven't developed our prefrontal cortex to override those fear-based responses. Everybody, if they had this toolkit, you would lower the volume on the amount and severity of these illnesses. There's no doubt about it. If everybody worked on trying to understand their own challenging, self-defeating behaviors, I think we could do so much just for everybody in their sphere. Like, I'm still married today because I'm in recovery, right? Like, it's not simply about me not drinking and drugging. I want to have a life where I'm not constantly getting it, feeling like my feelings are hurt, feeling I'm not getting what I want, or I'm going to lose what I have. Those are those fears. Most people, if they're not in recovery, don't know about this stuff. It's the miracle of why we're so fortunate to be in recovery, why you hear people say, I'm a gratefully recovering alcoholic. I mean, why would someone be grateful to be an alcoholic and a drug addict? But the reality is you have an entree to living a life that you wouldn't otherwise have if you weren't forced to get recovery by dint of your illness. And I would say that the lessons of recovery are universal to everybody. You don't have to have an addiction to benefit from those toolkits that we are given on how to understand our thinking patterns. So, and I know that, as I said, if your parents aren't skilled in their own self-awareness, it's going to make it difficult for your kids to learn those skills because they don't see it modeled. And, it's, watch what I do, not what I say. Actions speak louder than words. And we need to show people around us what recovery looks like. Now, unfortunately, because we were not aware, previous generations, the cyclical kind of dysfunction gets passed on to new generations.
Right. And I think, what I was getting at is that when people go to the doctor and they're like, they screen them for like high blood sugar, they screen them for diabetes, they screen them for high blood pressure. And they're like, here, just take a pill and your stuff will go down. But they're not addressing the root. They're not telling them you need to exercise, you need to lose weight, you need to change the way you eat. So what does that look like from a mental health perspective? Is it learning how to manage your emotions? Is it learning about fear? Is it exercise? Is it choosing better people to spend time with? Like, what's the foundation that people need to build to help them navigate their mental health? Like, what responsibilities does each individual need to take to manage their own mental health effectively?
Well, you're absolutely right in identifying diabetes and even cardiovascular disease, the way we eat, cancer, what we expose ourselves to, and so forth. So much of our behavior is setting up these chronic illnesses and making them worse. So what's shocking to me is the people with the money, big payers, federal government and the like, have not figured out if we want to reduce the costs of the 80% of the public, 80% of the spend in Medicare and Medicaid, it goes to less than 20% of the people who are covered by Medicare and Medicaid. And all of that is high cost patients who've never been screened or treated for depression, anxiety, and so forth. So there's no doubt behavior counts for a lot. Now, to the point with just generally speaking, we haven't got in our culture the idea that, choose your hard. We avoid, stress, we avoid pain. It's a natural human reaction. But we need to understand early in life that, it's painful to do what we have to do to make a living, to go out, to be part of the world. It's even more painful if you avoid that. Now, we don't really have a conversation about that. Like, I try to tell my kids that every day they're making decisions on what kind of life they're going to have in the future by the decisions they make today. I only have that awareness, right? Because as I said, I'm in recovery. So I think we just need more literacy, Doug. That's what you're kind of nailing, is that we're very illiterate in this country about, frankly, the most important thing that could reduce the diabetes. I mean, if you weren't eating the sugar, if you could manage to not eat in order to feel better, like what a revelation. I totally want to finish the pint. I don't want to stop at a couple spoonfuls. We all want to, I don't want to go work out. I know I'm going to feel better tomorrow if I haven't binged on this. I know I'm going to feel better if I've worked out. But we haven't, put ourselves in a position where we know we have to do things that don't necessarily feel good in order to avoid things that will really not feel good down the line. So, you're talking about just changing the culture, really. That's a public health issue, frankly. You're addressing this from a public health. Our whole system is about treating an illness as opposed to educating, preparing, and promoting a public health approach. So, President Kennedy awarded the Presidential Physical Fitness. That was when it first came on the scene. And there's something attractive about, achieving your best. And we as Americans love, competing and being our best. So we have to also think about that mentally. And there are mental skills, mental muscles that we can build up. We're not aware of that. We just don't appreciate. We just kind of assume that we're going to know how to make decisions and avoid, the kinds of things that are going to get us physically sick. That's just, no one talks about that anywhere. Like you're talking about it now, but I can tell you, no one asks these questions.
Well, there's no money to be made in telling people to get healthy by exercising, right? So,
right.
I mean, yeah, I think that I always say that fitness, I believe, is the most underutilized tool to help people in recovery because of what it does from a mental health and a physical health standpoint. Obviously, the other stuff is important as well. The other, I don't really talk politics on here, but I think as a whole, it seems like, generally speaking, there's like two extremes. There's the side that's like compassion, and we need to help these people out, and it's not their fault, so let's take care of them. Then there's the other side that's like, pick yourself up by the bootstraps, full accountability and responsibility. And obviously, like personally, I think it's somewhere in the middle. Like you have to take responsibility for your behavior, but you also have to have compassion for people that are struggling, I think. Doesn't mean that you agree with what they're doing, but you have to have some level of empathy and understanding. Like, what are your thoughts on all that? Being that you're a former politician and that you're seeing this now, I mean, we're in the biggest political divide I think I've ever seen in my lifetime, and I'm sure maybe even in your lifetime as well.
So, in recovery, we have a responsibility not to drink and drug because we know of the harm that it causes everyone around us. And we know that we could end up killing someone else if we continue to drink and drug and get behind a wheel, do other things that pose a danger to others and to ourselves. We have that moral. We should be held accountable, and that is our responsibility. Having the disease of alcoholism does not give us the freedom to choose to go drink and drug when we know we're alcoholics, and when we are in a position where in sobriety, we have to work on keeping that sobriety. Now, if you're in the middle of your disease, I can guarantee you don't have insight to your disease having taken you hostage, basically. It just took you prisoner of war. I mean, you are locked up in your own brain. You cannot see your way out of it. And in those cases, we need to have, the Green Berets go in there, kick down the door, and bring people out. We don't have that ability to have essentially guardianship, conservatorship, really aggressive interventions. I had to get guardianship over my mother along with my brother and sister. She was going to absolutely kill someone else or kill herself. And we had to fight our way through the courts to get, control over all of her decision making because she was in a totally self-destructive spiral. It it should not be so difficult for family members to save their loved ones. There are ways, I think, to avoid the abuses of the past where people would just be, locked up against their will. We have medical assessments. We have third party assessments. We can do all of that. But right now, so many people are languishing on the streets, an active addiction and mental illness. They don't know how to get help. We think that it's their responsibility. We think it's, even the very left, thinks, oh, we can't intervene. That's, violating their civil liberties. But the fact is, those people who are living on the street are going to die with their civil liberties, as opposed to live to another day where they can finally have their agency back and be able to make those decisions. So I think we can't blame people who are active if we're not out there trying to help them get out of this self-destructive spiral. We owe them. It's not compassionate to let them, like there's these proposals to have consumption sites for addiction. I mean, it's just such an insult to this disease that says, oh, well, we can't do any more, so we're just going to let you, basically inject yourself and, oh, we'll watch you to make sure you don't die. I mean, that's 8 hours a day, 12 hours. What's going to be the next 12 hours? I mean, it's not going to save anybody. Maybe while they're in the consumption site, we're going to save their lives. This idea is selling people short, leaving them on the street by not getting active intervention, frankly, against their will, because they don't even know. Their disease is talking for them. I think that there's lots that we need to correct in terms of being responsible ourselves to helping those around us who suffer from these illnesses out of their suffering. I think the police that pulled me over, who arrested me, saved my life, right? So there is something to be said. The criminal justice system, say what you will, is the way a lot of my fellows get into the rooms of recovery. So we need to make sure that it's, when it's non-punitive, but we give people a very clear choice, whether they want to get help or, whether they're going to get incarcerated. I think there's, when the pain gets great enough, we change. That's the narrative in recovery. And for me, I got the gift of desperation. I needed to get better. It was my decision because I couldn't stand the pain anymore. So that doesn't address the political polarization you mentioned, but it does address the responsibility issue. The polarization, I think, is because we want certainty in this world, where it's this messy business of democracy where you have to compromise with people that you don't agree with is no one likes to do. But I grew up, my late father, Ted Kennedy, worked with John McCain, Sam Brownback, Orrin Hatch. Orrin Hatch, when he ran for office, said, my vote is going to cancel out Ted Kennedy's. And he won overwhelmingly because everybody hated Ted Kennedy and his liberal politics. They ended up becoming best friends, and they ended up getting major bills passed because the Republicans knew, well, if we got Orrin Hatch on it, we're safe. The Democrats knew, well, if Ted Kennedy signed off, it's as good as it can get. And boom, you get the national interest rather than the Democratic interest or the Republican interest. And that is the way democracy runs. In most places in the world, there are dictatorships, obviously China, Russia, among the most well-known. But frankly, in many parts of the rest of the world, it's dictatorships. It's the normal way is to have kind of dictatorships. And we are the exception. And right now, I'm really worried as a nation, we're about to end our democratic experiment, because if we can't work together, if we can't respect majority rule instead of like all my way or the highway, we're going to lose this great experiment called democracy.
Obviously, homelessness is an issue that a lot of people care about because, not just from a compassion standpoint, but from like a where they're living standpoint. I mean, these cities are just rampant with homelessness, and obviously, not everybody who's homeless is quote unquote dangerous. I'm not saying that at all, but you mentioned that a lot of people are openly just using drugs on the streets and people are letting them get away with it and not really genuinely helping them. Do you think that people who are actively, committing crimes on the streets and or abusing drugs should be forced against their will into some sort of psychiatric unit or into jail if they're committing a crime? Like, what are your thoughts on all that?
Well, I visited the care courts that Gavin Newsom is putting together, like Darrell Steinberg and many others out in California. And that is assertive community treatment. They go after and actively treat, actively engage, active. And they found that by sticking with someone, by continuing to intervene, by making available the resources for people to get help, they get better. Now, that needs to be exhausted. I'm not talking about wholesale, we're going to pick everybody up and, force some kind of care on them. But you can do 90% better than you're doing today just by being more proactive. We throw up our hands way too soon. How many times does it take people the intervention before it takes? But we're not even trying, we're not even intervening in the first place. So, but as you heard me say, I got guardianship over my mother. My mother today is able to play with my kids because we saved her life against her will at the time. She happy about it now? You bet she's happy about it now. She didn't know at the time. I didn't know at the time when I was active in my addiction how bad it was. I was fortunate to have people really intervene. In these illnesses, people don't want to intervene. They say, well, that's their business. I don't want to be intrusive. That's not my business. That's what allows people to, self-destruct. We have to talk about this. It has to be part of our public discussion. And unfortunately, people don't really know about this. They need to understand this is what treatment looks like. This is what intervention looks like. We don't wait to have this conversation until it's a crisis. These are the things we need to change in our culture, as you keep pointing out, that would save a whole lot of lives. And, guns, so many men end up taking their lives. And, they have the, suicide ideation. They have, certain alcoholism, addiction, depression, but it's that coupled with access to lethal means. Women do not end up taking their life at the same rate because they use less lethal means, and many of them don't end up taking their life with the finality that having a gun does. So, Pete Corelli, General Corelli, 4-star general, ran operations in Iraq and Iraq-Afghan war. He fought the Department of Defense to make sure that when physicians saw a veteran that was suicidal, that they asked them, do they have a gun in the house? Can they secure it? Simple interventions like that. And then for people who have experienced self-harm, we shouldn't just let them roll out of the emergency room and have no follow-up. We ought to be actively engaged to helping them understand their self-destructive patterns. This notion that it's all or nothing, that I have nothing to do in my life but to take my life, is a counterproductive thinking pattern that actually can be expelled through practice. Just like understanding where someone's delusions are, understanding your compulsions if you're in addiction, we can dramatically mediate these impulsive, compulsive, actions by first being able to develop the skills to identify those so that we can then address them. But if you're just subject to your compulsion with no insight that you can do anything about it, you're going to pick up and drink and drug, or you're going to end up taking your life. again, we could be doing so much, Doug, to reduce the total number of deaths dramatically. We don't need like this super reactive solution. We just need to be doing what we know works with greater fidelity, and we'd be losing less people.
In the context of addiction, obviously overdose deaths continue to skyrocket each year. From my understanding, it seems that fentanyl is the main thing to blame. Like the idea of somebody being able to quote unquote experiment with drugs is gone because of fentanyl. Which when I grew up, a lot of people could do that and get away with it and then grow out of it. It was like a phase, right? And then obviously there was other people that got addicted to certain drugs. Do you think that the underlying issue with all of this is mental health, or with addiction specifically, or do you think that fentanyl is just made it impossible for addicts to kind of survive or work their way out of it because it's killing so many people too soon?
Well, again, we still haven't corrected our thinking, like you point out, that previous generation, for the most part, people could experiment and not end up taking their lives because there wasn't the potency of the drugs that were being experimented with like there is today. And we haven't graduated from that. So there's still this idea that it's okay because that's what kids do. They experiment. Listen, there is no room to experiment with anything these days, given the threats of any type of drug that we might have taken ourselves a generation ago. Today can be laced with fentanyl or some other, drug that is synthetic, right? And it's laced in the weed and cocaine and the amphetamines, and the oxycontins laced with. So it's everywhere. So we need to have a major public health education campaign and as parents and as adults, we need to double down that this is not an option and model behavior that is not addictive, which is, as I said, with the expansion of marijuana, marijuana's, a high potency like we've never seen before. I mean, people are going into active psychosis because when I smoked it, it was like 2 or 3%. Today, it's well over 20 at a minimum, and you can smoke 90% THC. And furthermore, you can eat it, which just definitely leads people into this unconscious way of thinking, that didn't work, I can eat that. You don't know how much you're eating. They even have THC infused, what they call elixirs. That's like your Fanta grape aid infused with THC. I mean, I'm just so glad these things weren't around when I was active. And we have a responsibility not to be doing that to our kids, because what we do is slowly inculcate that it's okay to get blotto and bond. And of course, even like gambling, I think the sports betting is going to be such a nightmare. I mean, it already is, but you can't turn on the television without seeing ads for sports betting. I know that gambling addiction is the highest correlation to suicide of any addiction. And people don't know that. I know that because I'm in the field. But again, the more people that use, which of course is what advertising does, or for marijuana, for sports betting, the more people who are at risk are going to be obviously pushed into active addiction, and then all of the challenges that comes from it. But we are not setting a very good example about saving your brain, saving your mental health. It's not part of our culture. We have a culture where, I was just at the Phillies game here. My whole Little League from Brigantine was up there watching. And, used to have Budweiser here. Now they have, vodka spritzers. They have the hard lemonade. It's just remarkable how our culture just doesn't understand the correlation between what we are giving the green light to for all of us, and the fact that our kids, who, by the way, as we talked about earlier in this podcast, are suffering from the highest rates of anxiety and depression and so forth, what do you think they're going to do? If there's more pot shops in your neighborhood, you're going to, try that. And if it feels good, like it would have with me, you're going to try it again and again. Then you're going to be really on the fast track. So it's so the height of irresponsibility, especially with our kids, so desperate for relief because of the imposition of social media itself addictive, that we are now just putting more and more barriers in their path. And obviously fentanyl is part of that continuum. You warm people up to addiction, and then they're experimenting more, or they're making decisions under the influence where instead of saying no to that pill, they're at a party, they're high, boom, they take it. So all of this is interconnected. And frankly, we're not going to have to worry about interdiction because you can make all of these synthetics here at home, so to speak. Yes, in the past, it's, cocaine coming up from, Colombia, from places south across the border. Yes, you have, but today with synthetic drugs, so many of them can be made right in your bathtub. And the idea that we're going to be able to interdict these things is a misnomer. We have to do what we can to interdict the precursors, which are the chemicals that you can manufacture these synthetics with. But what I'm saying is there isn't this old, simple approach. We need to educate people that this is a threat, and it's a public health threat. It's taking so many lives, and we ought to be addressing it with that same urgency.
So obviously, like, one person can't change the entire culture, but if there's a parent who's listening to this and their number one concern is keeping their kids, safe, keeping them alive, like, what advice do you have to help them set their kids up in the best way possible?
Well, first of all, as I said, I'm trying to be intentional about when I'm around my kids to put my own phone down. I can't tell them to put theirs down and me not model that. I am fortunate they all are active in sports. They all get a great thrill and sense of themselves. My son just turned 12 today, one of my children. He won, he's third in the whole state of New Jersey for the free throw competition. He has just got a really mean three-pointer. He loves travel basketball, and I go with him at night. We pray. These things that, of course, I find old fogey. I just do because I want to give my children as much kind of foundation, like looking at them, hugging them. My 5-year-old, I got him out of bed this morning, and I, just hold that kid. It's for my own. I love the feeling, but you know what? It's good for them. I play with my kids. I'm just saying, like, people are busy. We all have busy lives, but those kids need to know when I'm in the playroom with my 5-year-old, he's looking up every 3 seconds to see if I'm looking at him, right? Like, they need that reinforcement. We're providing the foundation for them. So I think to myself, yes, I could go out, maybe make more money, set them up more, or if I don't pay enough attention to them now, I'm going to have to spend all that money in the future trying to get enough mental health and addiction care. Like, I literally kind of have to think that we can prevent as much as possible by just showing that unconditional love, holding them, encouraging sports, their own self-esteem, making sure they get enough sleep. Sleep, my 15-year-old, we have to enforce sleep hygiene. She will not be mentally well if she doesn't get enough sleep. These are such simple things, but if we start doing them, our kids stand a better chance.
So you think that modeling essentially is what is going to be the most effective way for parents to do the best they can to prevent their kids from falling down a path of addiction or mental health chaos?
I talk to my kids all about my own addiction. Thanks to virtual meetings today, and I'm driving them, I'll put my meeting app on. I'll log into a meeting in Chicago, LA, Washington, Philly. If I don't have that meeting exactly at the same time as I'm driving them somewhere, I'll tell them about, our thinking patterns. I'll tell them why they need to be thinking in this way, that they have to act their way into new ways of thinking. I get celebrate when they say thank you, when they open the door for someone, when they look out for someone else. I give them all that reinforcement so they get it. They get it. So there's lots of things, and I'm not perfect. I just try to be much more intentional, not let this stuff slide. I got to hit them now with it, because by the time they hit teenage years, to try to reel that back in, then it is more difficult. So if I kind of set it up, it'll be easier, hopefully, to have those conversations with them. And it won't be like, there goes dad, and complaining and so forth. But they will have known that I will have talked about this with them for their whole lives.
Playing the devil's advocate a little bit, based on a lot of the stuff we've talked about, there's some people will say, like, I get it. I understand we have this mental health crisis and it's really sad, but I don't want my like taxpayer dollars going to that. Like, it's not my problem. Like, it's like, that's their issue. They got to figure it out. It's unfortunate. What do you say to them to try to get your point across, to convince them that it is important and that you're not just, pissing away money to fix other people's problems?
Well, my wife's a public school teacher. And, about 20 years ago, it dawned on our Chamber of Commerce, our business, and our country that we were not going to compete with China, Japan, Europe, if we did not improve our science, technology, engineering, and math skills. Like, we're just not going to compete on a global level. So what did we do? We had STEM education. We changed our curricula. Today, you can have all the STEM skills you want, but if you don't have social emotional learning skills, you're not going to be as productive. You're going to have greater disability. You're going to be at work, but not at work. They call that presenteeism. So and as we talked about earlier, your rest of your healthcare costs are going to explode. And, our criminal justice system will continue to have 75% recidivism rate within 5 years of leaving the state jail, if we do not address, the kinds of supports earlier on where people we know, in other words, the data, Doug. So the data doesn't lie. The data says we're going to have less taxes if we incentivize people being healthier. So the accountable care organizations, what happens? If they don't keep people well, they have to eat the reimbursement for their hospitalization, for their emergency room visit. They have a financial incentive to keep people healthy so they don't have to treat them again. They get paid once, and that's it. So my point is, let's think about all the costs in our country, a direct result of the fact we don't have a public mental health system. 2, think about all the physical costs we have because we don't incorporate mental health and addiction care. And 3, no one has ever asked about whether we shouldn't spend more money on cancer. And, these illnesses are taking more lives than cancer. And we don't spend a fraction what we spend on cancer. So if you really want to save money, let's cut the costs of taking care of people with Parkinson's, with cancer, with Alzheimer's. Last time I checked, mental health and addiction hits our young and grabs them and keeps them hostage for a better part of their life. In other words, the disability from addiction mental health takes them out early and throughout the course of their lives, accounts for what they call disability adjusted life years. Most of the rest of the illnesses, of course, not all, hit people later in life. The tragedy of these illnesses, it hits people in the prime of their life. So the cost to our economy. We can't get enough people to serve in our military, Doug. They're not passing the drug tests. They just aren't passing the drug tests. How are we going to keep, enough people to serve in our military? How are we going to keep enough people to drive our economy if we have so many young? The churn in our workforce is so great today. So you talk to any major business owner, they'll tell you biggest threat to their business is the fact they're turning over employees 40% every year. It's so there is a fact, and the fact is this: if we do a better job preventing these illnesses, treating them in a timely way, it reduces the costs of our criminal justice system, which unfortunately is the biggest mental health system in our country. It reduces the cost of our healthcare, and it improves our productivity as a nation. So we don't evaluate all those other cost savings to the system. And that's why people have a very narrow view. Oh, this is costing me money. It's too expensive. The opposite is true. It's too expensive not to invest in this space.
Well, Patrick, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for your time. I love the conversation. If people want to get a copy of your books, I know you have a new one that you've written, I think 1 or 2 in the past, right?
This one is Profiles in Mental Health Courage. 5 individuals and their families, their stories. My first book is A Common Struggle. In the back of both books, there's a mental health and addiction agenda, so people can use a QR code URL to go to alignmentforprogress.org or go to the kennedyforum.org and learn about how they can be active, because we need to change public policy if we want to change the results of these illnesses.
Amazing, Patrick. Well, thank you so much again for coming on. Love the conversation. I think my audience is going to enjoy it as well.
Thank you, Doug. All the best to you.
Likewise.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, I really think you're going to like this video as well. I'll see you there.